A new bill is expected to pass in the US Congress, which would formally allow for the indefinite detention of anyone, including American citizens, as long as the government calls them terrorists. You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rutansi. It's a question which has plagued US governments for a decade: how to keep Americans safe from terrorist attack while at the same time holding up the American ideals of liberty for its citizens. Since September 11th, the US has held, quote, enemy combatants at the Guantanamo Bay Military Detention Center. Many are still held there without trial. This proposed bill, though, expands the list of those who can be detained from those with direct connection to 9/11 to anyone suspected of substantially supporting al-Qaeda or associated forces. Perhaps the most controversial clause in the bill, it would formally allow for US citizens to be detained indefinitely. Americans, too, could potentially face military court on terrorism-related charges. Critics say the military should protect Americans, not roam their streets. Another major critique, the provision says suspects can be held until the war on terror is over, but no one says how or when that will happen. And finally, by giving the military more power, some complain that the bill would hamper FBI and local law enforcement investigations. The bill generated heat as it was debated in the US Senate. Here are some of the highlights.
We are at war with al-Qaeda, and people determined to be part of al-Qaeda should be treated as people who are at war with us.
I'm very concerned about how this language would be interpreted, not in the here and now as we see the stability that we brought to our country since 9/11, but if something were to happen.
We must hold detainees for as long as it takes to gather information our intelligence and law enforcement professionals need to take down terrorist networks and to stop attacks.
We have over 300 terrorists who've been prosecuted through our civil system who are in jail, many of them for life sentences that will outlast their lifespans. Let's not fix something that isn't broken until we really understand what the consequences are.
So are civil liberties in the US being permanently eroded? And is the principle of indefinite detention without trial now an accepted part of American life? To discuss this, we're joined by Rear Admiral John Hudson, a retired US naval officer and until recently the president of the New Hampshire School of Law. He's in Jacksonville, Florida. In the studio, I'm joined by Shahid Buttar, a civil rights lawyer. And also here, Sebastian Gorka, a military affairs analyst at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Shahid Buttar, then, what are the implications of this bill?
The NDAA, the Defense Authorization Act, has profound consequences for our Constitution. It would abrogate the First, Fifth, and Sixth Amendments in one fell swoop, eliminating due process and the right to trial. It would cut the Article III judiciary out of its constitutionally required mandated role, and it would really render the U.S. Much less than the free society that we've long championed. And I think it would really, quite frankly, beg the question as to whether we're even in the free world, let alone its leader. It's
interesting, actually, because we have a Gallup poll on this sort of issue. The Gallup polling agency asking Americans, should the government take all necessary steps to prevent additional acts of terrorism in the US, even if it means your basic civil liberties would be violated? More people think civil liberties should be protected as we get further away from September of 2001. In January of 2002, the split was nearly 50-50. But in August of this year, 71% said the government should prevent attacks without affecting civil liberties. It hasn't caught terrible fire, perhaps, in the general media, but certainly the online hacking group Anonymous recently posted a video, and it seemed to summarize some of the more apocalyptic kind of predictions. Let's take a look at what they had to say.
The passage of this law is nothing less than an outright declaration of war against the American people by the military-connected power elite. If this is signed into law, it will shred the remaining tenets of the Bill of Rights and unleash upon America a total military dictatorship. If you have not yet woken up to the reality of the police state we've been warning you about, I hope you realize we are fast running out of time. Once this becomes law, you have no rights whatsoever in America, no due process, no First Amendment speech rights, no right to remain silent, nothing.
And that's been viewed 2 million times, we understand. Sebastian Gorka, clearly that was very bombastically put, but isn't this an issue that does require some pretty serious discussion, some drama actually involved in this? It's a terribly serious moment.
Well, I think America is a democracy and we will see discussion on these issues, but the primary question is, do we feel safe? Has the menace of global jihad, of Al-Qaeda and associated movements been destroyed? If you think that we're still not safe, if you think that the death of bin Laden doesn't actually mean the collapse of all Salafist organizations committed to the destruction of Western democracy, then you're going to be on the side of actually providing and maintaining those tools that are needed to protect the United States from further attacks.
Admiral, we are at war. This is a price that we have to pay. And yet you wrote, the enemy is just laughing over this. What did you mean?
By that comment, I meant that our great strength, our values and our ideals, what we stand for as a nation, and what we stood for the last 225 years or so. And to the extent we disarm ourselves, to the extent we abrogate those values and those ideals, we hurt ourselves militarily. We cause ourselves to be weaker rather than stronger. I think that all of us probably have the same ultimate goal, which is to be a strong, secure nation while at the same time protecting our civil liberties. But when we do some of the things that are contained in the National Defense Authorization Act and involve the military, beginning with investigations, through prosecutions, and then ultimately through detentions, in an area that is not part of the military mission. The military mission of the armed forces is to fight and win our nation's wars, and the military, the U.S. military, does that mission exceedingly well. But when you ask them then to do instead, or in addition to that, the mission of what is essentially the Department of Justice, it makes us weaker, and rather than having the high ground, which is what any military strategist or tactician wants to have, we end up sort of in the lower end of the ground, and that's not good for us. And the enemy can't defeat us militarily. You know, they don't have the firepower to defeat us militarily. The only way they can defeat us is to cause us to change ourselves, and that's a self-inflicted wound.
Sebastian Gorka?
I think today, if you look at September the 11th, it is evidence of the fact that thinking in terms of purely military or non-military, that's a bygone era. The idea that you can have a sharp division of mandates and authorities, and that soldiers only do Gulf War I type scenarios, the military only does World War II type scenarios. You're living in fantasy land if you think that's the reality. Today, September the 11th proves the fact that we are not in what used to be called a Westphalian environment. We have people who are in America now, committed to the subversion of the country and its citizens. This is not the Second Red Army with tanks in the Sabessa Gap along the East German border.
You're right, it's much less bad than that. It is dramatically less threatening.
I think it's far worse, because you have an irrational actor. You have an actor who believes he has God on his side. Why did Khrushchev never press that?
Accidents in the last 10 years by an order of magnitude than there have been.
How many thousands of Muslims have been killed by Al-Qaeda? I mean, if we want to count numbers.
We're talking about U.S. civil liberties, right? So
we're talking about a global threat.
You know, I disagreed.
A global threat.
I disagreed with the clip that you ran before with some of the rhetoric of a military dictatorship and all our rights being given up. But as I hear Sebastian talk, I think, well, maybe that is more what our fate will be. If we can't keep a pretty bright line between fighting a war and domestic law enforcement, we will have repealed essentially the Posse Comitatus Act, right, which has stood us in good stead since just after the Civil War.
Well, I think we've had,
and we will be in a military dictatorship.
And it's interesting that, Sebastian, you have taken that line, because you are talking then basically about the militarization of American society.
I'm not. You can't confuse values with operational requirements. You know, I am, anybody who accuses me of being pro-dictatorship better watch their words. My father was put in prison for a life sentence by a communist dictatorship. So I am fully committed to the values of this nation. All I'm saying is the idea that one can draw very clear, thick lines between what is a Miranda right requirement for a US citizen arrested for a common crime and between what happens to an individual arrested not wearing military clothing in a battlefield outside the United States who then has to be dealt with by the US system. This is not your grandfather's war.
What about US citizens within the United States? The NDAA would authorize military detention without trial of U.S. citizens. And the two pieces that I think none of us have discussed yet, the first is that the right to trial is fundamental. It has stood for almost a millennium. These are fundamental protections, and the Defense Authorization Act is flatly incompatible with the values of this country.
And before we get into that, and that is very important, these constitutional issues clearly are the key to all of this, we did actually get a cross-section of views in Washington, D.C., and it was interesting, actually. There wasn't, not everyone immediately went, well, we've got to save the Constitution. Let's just take a look anyway.
After 9/11, you have to wonder, with the things that have happened in this nation and in this world, if our civil liberties have to take precedence over national security and the lives of thousands of American people.
These civil liberties come first, I believe, unless they're proven that they are a threat or they're security risks.
What's going on in America right now is kind of fear-led. And what we're doing is we're kind of undermining the constitutional abilities. The Constitution is very clear about how we detain U.S. citizens and how we don't.
I think the fears are way overdone. I think that civil liberties, we must remember where we came from.
Sure, but I mean, there is this huge constitutional question. There's this question about what America even stands for that both you and the Admiral have alluded to. And yet, though, the controversy about this bill as far as the White House and Congress are concerned doesn't seem to be a bit about those issues,
right.
as far as I can tell.
It indicates, I think, the failure of our Washington institutions, both Congress's abject failure to consider the constitutional implications of its own acts, and quite frankly, the White House's abdication of its own role in the checks and balances. Congress was created by the founders of our country to check and balance executive power. And what we've seen with the Defense Authorization Act is Congress not only granting the executive every power that it has asked for, which it has done routinely over the last 10 years with the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, but now Congress has actively outflanked the executive branch in forcing upon it powers that our elected leadership actively repudiates.
And in fact, I mean, we have a clip now from the White House press secretary talking about it, because I mean, the White House did actually threaten to veto this bill, but it wasn't because of the constitutional issues necessarily. And this is what the White House press secretary said before some further language had been placed in the bill to perhaps give more of a compromise between the two sides. But this is what Jay Carney had to say.
Counterterrorism professionals from Republican and Democratic administrations, as you know, Ed, have said that the language in this bill would jeopardize our national security by restricting flexibility in our fight against al-Qaeda. Any bill that challenges or constrains the president's critical authorities to collect intelligence, incapacitate dangerous terrorists, and protect the nation would prompt his senior advisors to recommend a veto.
Admiral, I mean, does it concern you, though, that as far as this battle goes in D.C. is concerned, you've perhaps already lost the battle? I mean, all this bill really does is codify powers that the U.S. president already thinks he has. And in fact, the only reason he doesn't like the bill is because he thinks it ties his hands to take even more extreme action, perhaps.
Well, no, I disagree with that characterization. I think that what this bill does is essentially require that that terrorists be prosecuted in military commissions and that they have to be turned over to military custody and interrogators. And basically, the president doesn't want his hands to be tied in that way. He wants to be able to use, the greatest investigative authority in the world, the FBI, and the greatest judicial system on the face of the earth, U.S. Federal courts. And so,
but are you sure it's so benign, though? I mean, some are wondering whether he's concerned that this in codifying what the limits of executive power are, he can't use more extreme measures, using the CIA, using other methods and so forth, at his own discretion. Now there is some accountability. Now Congress is actually watching what he's doing. The executive has already presumed extraordinary powers in this time of the war on terror.
the commander-in-chief, the President of the United States, in his role as commander-in-chief, ought to have, not unlimited authority, but very broad authority to prosecute this conflict, this struggle, this war, whatever we call it, in the way that he sees fit, in consonance with the Geneva Conventions and the law of armed conflict and a host of conventions and treaties that we have ratified. But what this does in many respects is force him, the United States, to deal with terrorists in a particular, or alleged terrorists, in a particular way that
Can we just pause there really quick?
is
The
not
alleged
helpful
terrorist
to
part
us.
is really important.
The tilt is toward indefinite detention, and it inhibits civil liberties.
Well,
and I don't think the President wants to do that.
You interjected that. It is quite important always to remember that what we're talking about there is the indefinite detention of people who have never actually been proven to have done anything wrong.
People who are accused but not
Right.
proven. We have courts for a reason, right? And checks and balances on executive power are critical to maintain liberty. And the Admiral correctly stated, I think, that the President, while correctly entitled to broad authority, should certainly not have unlimited authority, and the authority to subject U.S. citizens to indefinite military detention without access to counsel, an impartial judge, the opportunity to confront.
But again, I return to what the White House argument there was. He didn't make, Jay Carney didn't make some spirited defense of the Constitution there.
No, the
He
White
was
House
talking about having Congress perhaps limit executive power in doing whatever they want, frankly. I mean, Sebastian Gorka.
But even if you look at the issues in the Constitution, there's precedence for all of these actions, whether it's President Roosevelt during World War II, whether it's one of the greatest presidents ever, Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, the suspension of habeas corpus or the indefinite detention of U.S. citizens is nothing new. The question is, do you believe we are still at war? And yes,
And the President has shown that you forget about indefinite detention of American citizens.
Lincoln in the Civil War
He's
got
killing
habeas corpus stuff down his throat.
The President has actually said that, as far as he's concerned, he can kill an American citizen in Yemen without any.
As long as they're not in the U.S. So you can militarily detain them if they're here, but you can assassinate them abroad.
But again, but from Sebastian Gorka's point of view there, of the need for extraordinary powers then, might this not actually be the limit on the extraordinary powers that you actually rather favor for the executive to do whatever he wants, unchecked by Congress?
I am in favor of checks and balances, but the disagreement between us here seems to hinge upon whether we are in war. And yes, the courts are there for a reason. They are there to deal with normal criminal cases occurring in the U.S., which have actually been committed in the U.S., mostly by U.S. citizens. The U.S. court system was not created to deal with enemy combatants. That is why you have the Geneva Conventions, that is why you have the Hague Protocols, and that is why if you are captured in wartime as an enemy combatant, we have no obligation to release you or to give you due process. You are to be kept incommunicado in a facility for as long as the war takes. And we are still fighting this war.
We are dealing with abstractions here. Please,
Admiral, go ahead.
We have almost 400 terrorists in federal prison right now who have been prosecuted by federal courts. And, military commissions have had 6 terrorists prosecuted, all of whom pled guilty except one who refused to participate in his own defense. So, I mean, in terms of what has been effective, it's clearly the federal courts.
So how about, the mention of the Geneva Conventions is interesting because there's been some confusion and some surprise there that figures like Carl Levin, for example, supposed progressives, are all for this legislation. But when he was discussing it in Congress, he seemed to be suggesting that this was perhaps to give more oversight to prisoners and give them more prisoner of war status, Geneva Convention status. This is partly, as far as he's concerned, to prevent prisoners from being transferred to the CIA and being rendered to black sites and so forth. He said, should to be a member of an enemy force who's come to this nation to attack us as a member of a foreign enemy, should that person be treated according to the laws of war? The answer is yes. Carl Levin seems to think this actually will give extra oversight to prevent the government from handing people over to the CIA, having them tortured. And that's another reason perhaps why President Obama is terribly happy about this.
To whatever extent that may be true, I would invite members of Congress to remove the provisions that allow U.S. citizens detained within the U.S. who are presumably not enemy combatants, but will be, and this I think is what the anonymous video gets to, these will be alleged eco-terrorists. These will be people who are accused of providing material support in the form of donations to foreign charities. These are the people that we currently prosecute as terrorists. And so these, you'll notice, have very attenuated links to actual terrorism. The most common crime in the counterterrorism arena is lying to a federal agent, which absolutely has nothing to do with terrorism necessarily. And when we're talking about taking U.S. citizens, potentially prosecuted or not even prosecuted, this bill removes the need for prosecution, accused of involvement of terrorism on the basis of their First Amendment protected beliefs. We're talking about removing those individuals' right to trial and throwing away the key that this bill is absolutely the cornerstone of what we normally would a country with a bill like this, we would correctly call an authoritarian state.
There has been a lack of an outcry, though, given that, if that is the case.
There's never been a single hearing on this bill. No one even knows about it.
Is this just part of this sort of this almost very quiet lurch to the sort of state that you suggest? I mean, we have actually a list of all the legislation that preceded this bill. All the Patriot Act was passed after 9/11. Among those provisions, it made it easier for law enforcement to access telephone and email communications, financial and medical records. Then there was the Military Commission Act 5 years later. That allows the government to indefinitely detain non-citizens as enemy combatants. July 2008, an updated version of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was signed into law. That expanded the government's power to conduct surveillance without a warrant from a court. All these passed without much of a whimper. The Patriot Act was extended actually with full bipartisan support. Is this just how it's going to be, Sebastian Gorka, and this is how it has to be because we are at war? Is that what you're saying?
Think about the actual source for all this legislation originally, the legal system we're talking about. We're talking about the Hague and Geneva Conventions, the international laws that were brought 80, 70 years ago. We're talking about the national security system that was built in the United States in 1947 with the National Security Act that created the Department of Defense, that created the CIA. What was the actual circumstance for that law and for the Geneva and Hague Conventions? Who signed them? Nation states. Nation states that were trying to regulate combat between themselves. That's the nature of the international laws of war, and that is the nature of the National Security Act that shaped the architecture that America tried to fight Al-Qaeda with and failed. This system is inadequate, and I think that's what the NDA is trying to bridge.
I was suggesting this wasn't just going to be used against...
But no, the idea that this is going to be rampantly used against eco-terrorists and anybody who lies on an immigration form, they'll be locked away for the next 50 years, I think that's just not, that's amusing. This is going to be used for serious...
It's already the case that First Amendment protected activism has been prosecuted as terrorism. There was a case before the Supreme Court about
There's no reason to believe it's not going to be used that way. You know, Senator Feinstein did introduce an amendment to this that would exempt Americans from these provisions explicitly, and that was defeated.
Why would you exempt Americans if you look at Anwar al-Awlaki? Why on earth would you be fighting to exempt, yes, a constitution that...
And lots of people are accused.
And a legal system is based upon a social contract. That's the nature of the whole system of Western democracy, a social contract.
But again, I have to return to the point. I mean, this example of al-Awlaki shows how absurd perhaps this debate is, because the fact is the executive already takes on extraordinary powers. And as far as again, it's not about detention. This is about killing a U.S. citizen without any...
But
the case is fascinating. This is an individual who was a U.S. citizen. But what happened to him? He abrogated his normal access to the due process in this country when he declared... A review process. A review process which was run by the executive.
You said you're in favor of checks and balances.
We have, but when he's in Yemen, how are you going to bring him to a court?
Well, I'm more concerned about U.S. citizens within the United States for whom we do have courts available that are being actively cut out of the equation by this act of Congress. And it's important that we're talking about on the basis of accusation. You're presuming the facts in any given case as presented by the executive branch, but that's why we have a judiciary, because we don't trust prosecutors to make decisions about who should be locked up.
But in conclusion, Admiral, does it not worry, though, that the only reason the president might veto this bill is simply because he wants as much power as possible, and not necessarily because he has a problem with the constitutionality of indefinite detention for Americans? As Carl Levin himself said, it was the Obama administration who wanted Americans to be indefinitely, or allowed to be indefinitely detained in this bill.
You know, on the one hand, the president ought to, in his capacity as commander-in-chief, ought to be given very broad authority. On the other hand, he shouldn't be required to prosecute people in a particular location. And as the constitutional lawyer, I think that the president is offended by the concept of indefinite detention of Americans.
Thank you very much for joining us. Admiral Hudson.
That's quite all right. Thank you for having me.
Shahid Bhattar and Sebastian Gorka, thank you as well. That's it from the team in Washington, D.C., but we want to hear from you. Tell us the stories that you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at InsideStory@aljazeera.com.